It's 8 p.m. in medieval London. You're a craftsman walking home from the tavern where you've been drinking with friends. You hear it, the deep, resonant toll of the curfew bell echoing across the city. You have exactly the time it takes for the bell to finish ringing, maybe 10 minutes, to get home, get inside, cover your hearth fire, and bolt your door. If you're caught on the streets after the bell stops, the night watch will arrest you. You'll spend the night in jail. You'll pay a fine that's a week's wages. And if you're unlucky enough to be carrying a weapon, even a simple knife, they might assume you're a criminal and your punishment will be far worse. For over 500 years, from roughly the 11th century until the 17th, the curfew bell controlled urban life across medieval Europe. It dictated when you could move freely and when you were confined to your home. It determined who belonged on the streets and who didn't. It gave authorities absolute power to arrest anyone outdoors after a specific hour. And if you want to understand how cities actually controlled their populations long before modern police forces, surveillance cameras, or digital tracking, or subscribe to Ash and Crown History and like this video. On this channel, we explore how power, control, and everyday life really worked in the past. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, which literally means cover fire. That etymology tells you the original stated purpose: fire prevention. Medieval cities were tinderboxes. Buildings were primarily wood with thatched roofs packed closely together. Cooking and heating relied on open flames. A single unattended fire could destroy entire neighborhoods. Major urban fires were catastrophic and relatively common. London burned multiple times throughout the medieval period. Paris, Rouen, York, nearly every major city experienced devastating fires. The curfew bell's primary official function was to signal the time when all household fires had to be covered or extinguished. When you heard the bell, you were required to cover your hearth with a metal cover called a couvre-feu, the same word that became curfew. This reduced the risk of fires starting or spreading overnight when people were asleep and couldn't respond quickly. It was a practical public safety measure that everyone could understand and, in theory, support. But the curfew bell accomplished much more than fire prevention. It also signaled the closing of the city gates. Medieval cities were walled. And those walls had gates that were locked at night. Once the curfew bell rang, the gates would be closed and barred. No one could enter or leave the city until morning. If you were outside the walls when the bell rang, you were stuck there until dawn. If you were inside, you were locked in. The bell also marked the beginning of the night watch. Cities employed watchmen who patrolled the streets after curfew, looking for fires, criminals, and unauthorized persons. These watchmen had authority to stop anyone they found on the streets, demand to know their business, and arrest those without legitimate reasons for being out. The night watch was the precursor to modern police forces. And the curfew was what gave them their authority. After the bell rang, everyone on the streets was presumptively doing something wrong. The earliest curfew laws in England date to around 1068, just after the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror instituted curfew in towns throughout England, officially for fire prevention but also as a means of controlling the recently conquered Anglo-Saxon population. A population that couldn't gather or move freely at night was a population that couldn't organize rebellion. The curfew was social control disguised as public safety from the very beginning. By the 12th and 13th centuries, curfew was standard across European cities. Paris had curfew. So did London, York, Florence, Barcelona, Cologne, and virtually every other significant urban center. The specific times varied by location and season. Summer curfews might be at 9 p.m. when daylight lasted longer. Winter curfews might be as early as 6 or 7 p.m. The bell would ring from the city's main church tower or from a dedicated bell tower. And the sound would carry across the entire city. The bell itself was often one of the city's largest and most important. It wasn't a small handbell. It was a massive bronze bell weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds, designed to be heard throughout the urban area. Ringing it required physical effort, pulling on heavy ropes. And the bell would toll for several minutes, giving everyone time to hear it and respond. The sound was unmistakable and unavoidable. You couldn't claim you didn't hear it. Once the bell finished ringing, the rules were strict. You were required to be indoors in a private residence. Not just off the main streets. Indoors. Your doors were supposed to be locked or at least closed. Your fire was covered. And you stayed there until morning. Morning was signaled by a different bell, often called the Matins bell because it coincided with the early morning church service. Once the morning bell rang, you could leave your home and the city would return to normal daytime activity. But here's where it gets interesting, not everyone had to obey curfew. There were extensive exemptions. And those exemptions reveal that curfew was as much about class and social control as about fire safety. Nobles and aristocrats were generally exempt. They could move freely at night. Though they might need to carry torches or have servants announce them to the night watch. Clergy were exempt when conducting church business. Physicians were exempt when visiting patients. Midwives were exempt when attending births. City officials, including the night watch itself, were obviously exempt. So were people responding to genuine emergencies, like fires. If your house was burning, you were allowed to run for help. But you might need to prove the emergency was real. And you'd be questioned by the watch. Some professions received blanket exemptions. In some cities, bakers were exempt because they worked through the night preparing bread for the morning. Certain types of laborers whose work required night hours might be exempt with proper documentation. But these exemptions were privileges granted by city authorities, not rights. They could be revoked. And they came with the understanding that you were doing something productive and authorized, not just wandering around. Everyone else, the vast majority of the urban population, was required to stay home. This meant that working-class people, servants, apprentices, journeymen, poor laborers, they had no freedom of movement at night. Their time was not their own. The city, through the mechanism of the curfew bell, claimed control over their bodies and movements for roughly half of every day. Enforcement varied but could be severe. The night watch would patrol the streets looking for curfew violators. If they found you, they would demand to know your identity, your business, and where you were going. If you had a legitimate reason and could prove it, you might be escorted to your destination and warned. If you couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation, you'd be arrested. The typical punishment for first-time curfew violation was a night in jail and a fine. The fine was substantial, often equivalent to several days or even a week's wages for an ordinary laborer. This made curfew violation a serious economic penalty. For someone living on the margins, a curfew fine could be devastating. Repeat offenders faced harsher punishment. Multiple curfew violations might result in whipping, public humiliation in the stocks or pillory, or banishment from the city. The logic was that repeated violations showed disrespect for law and order and suggested the person was up to no good. If you were caught on the streets after curfew while carrying weapons, the presumption was that you intended to commit crimes. Weapons could include swords, knives, clubs, or any implement that could be used violently. The punishment for armed curfew violation was much more severe, potentially including extended imprisonment or mutilation. In some jurisdictions, you could be hanged as a presumed criminal simply for being armed after curfew, even if you hadn't actually committed any other crime. The curfew also applied differently based on where you were in the city. Main streets and commercial areas were patrolled most heavily. Side streets and residential neighborhoods might see less watch presence. The wealthy quarters of the city generally had lighter enforcement because the residents there had more political power and were less likely to be presumed criminals. The poor quarters had heavy enforcement because authorities assumed crime was more likely there. This created a geography of control where the poor were most restricted and most surveilled while the wealthy maintained relative freedom. A noble could travel through the city at night with minimal interference. A laborer doing the same thing would be immediately suspect and likely arrested. The practical effects on urban life were enormous. Curfew meant that the city essentially shut down at a specific hour. Taverns had to close before curfew or face penalties. Markets ended their trading before the bell. Entertainment, celebrations, social gatherings, all had to conclude in time for people to get home before curfew. This compressed the workday and social time into daylight hours and the few hours of evening before the bell rang. For the working poor, this was particularly constraining. If you worked from dawn to dusk, you had almost no free time. Your entire day was claimed by work. And then curfew confined you to your home. You couldn't socialize freely, couldn't organize with other workers, couldn't participate in nighttime entertainment or gatherings. The curfew reinforced social hierarchies by limiting when and how lower-class people could associate. Curfew also affected commerce. Goods couldn't be transported through the city at night. If you were a merchant with a shipment arriving at the city gates after curfew, it would have to wait outside the walls until morning. This created delays and costs. Night work was severely limited. Any activity that required movement through the city after curfew became much more complicated and expensive. But curfew did serve some legitimate purposes beyond social control. Fire prevention was real. Requiring people to cover their fires probably did reduce the risk of overnight fires. Though it's impossible to know how effective this was. Cities with strict curfew enforcement didn't necessarily have fewer fires than those without. But the perception was that curfew helped. Security was another legitimate concern. Medieval cities had crime. Robbery, assault, murder, these happened. And they were more common in the dark when there were fewer witnesses. The night watch did provide some security. And having streets largely empty after curfew made it easier to spot suspicious activity. If everyone was supposed to be home, anyone on the streets stood out. The curfew also helped with urban administration in various ways. It created a clear division between day and night, work and rest, public and private. This made cities more legible to authorities, easier to manage and control. Knowing that the population was confined to their homes for half the day simplified governance in a pre-modern era with limited administrative capacity. Different cities had different curfew practices and enforcement levels. London's curfew was relatively strict, with active night watch patrols and frequent arrests. The bell rang from various churches. But the main curfew bell at St. Martin's le Grand was particularly important. Parish records show regular payments to bell ringers and regular fines collected from curfew violators. Paris had an elaborate curfew system with different bells for different neighborhoods. The curfew was enforced by the city watch, called the Get, who were notorious for corruption and brutality. Parisian night watch had a reputation for using curfew as an excuse to shake down anyone they encountered, demanding bribes to avoid arrest. Some Italian cities had more relaxed curfews during certain times of year or for certain classes of people. Florence's curfew was notoriously flexible for wealthy citizens while being strictly enforced against the poor. Venice had complex curfew rules that varied by neighborhood and were entangled with the city's elaborate system of social surveillance. Smaller towns often had curfew in theory but lacked the resources to enforce it consistently. Without a dedicated night watch, curfew might be observed primarily as a social norm rather than a strictly enforced law. Villages rarely had formal curfew. Though rural areas had their own informal expectations about nighttime behavior. Over time, curfew evolved and weakened. By the 15th and 16th centuries, many cities were relaxing curfew enforcement, particularly for wealthier citizens and commercial activities. Economic growth meant more nighttime commercial activity that city governments didn't want to prohibit. The rise of street lighting, starting in the 16th century with mandatory lanterns hanging outside houses and later with oil lamps on posts, made nighttime streets safer and reduced the rationale for curfew. The Protestant Reformation affected curfew in some regions. Protestant cities sometimes saw curfew as a Catholic holdover and modified or eliminated it as part of broader reforms. Catholic cities generally maintained curfew longer, seeing it as part of proper Christian urban governance. By the 17th century, curfew was declining across Europe. London's curfew became largely unenforced, though it technically remained law. Paris maintained curfew into the 18th century but with so many exemptions and so much inconsistent enforcement that it was more symbolic than practical. Most German cities had abandoned strict curfew by the mid-1600s. The rise of professional police forces in the 18th and 19th centuries made curfew obsolete. Police could patrol at night and arrest criminals based on actual suspicious behavior rather than mere presence on the streets. The need for a blanket prohibition on nighttime movement disappeared when you had dedicated law enforcement that could distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate nighttime activity. Improved fire safety also reduced curfew's rationale. Buildings increasingly used brick and stone. Fire prevention techniques improved. Fire brigades were organized. The specific risk of household fires spreading and destroying entire neighborhoods declined, making the couvre-feu aspect of curfew less necessary. By the 19th century, curfew had largely disappeared from European cities as a regular practice. It persisted in some rural areas and conservative communities. And it could be reimposed during emergencies like wars, plagues, and civil unrest. But the daily curfew bell that had controlled urban life for 500 years was silent. Modern curfews exist but function differently. Youth curfews in American cities prohibit minors from being out after certain hours without adult supervision. These are justified as protecting young people and preventing juvenile crime. But they echo medieval curfew in treating presence in public space as inherently suspicious and giving police broad authority to stop and question people based solely on the time of day. Emergency curfews during riots, natural disasters, or pandemics prohibit everyone from being outdoors during specific hours. These are temporary and justified by genuine emergencies. But they demonstrate how quickly societies will resort to restricting movement when authorities perceive threats. The COVID-19 pandemic saw numerous jurisdictions impose curfews, often with questionable evidence that they actually helped control disease spread. Military curfews in occupied territories or martial law situations are the closest modern parallel to medieval curfew. They serve the same functions, controlling population movement, preventing gatherings, making resistance and organization difficult, and giving security forces absolute authority to arrest anyone outdoors after a certain hour. The medieval curfew bell reveals several uncomfortable truths about urban governance and social control. First, measures justified as public safety often serve broader control purposes. Fire prevention was real. But curfew accomplished much more than that. It restricted movement, prevented gatherings, made surveillance easier, and reinforced class hierarchies. The safety justification made the control palatable. Second, laws that apply theoretically to everyone often apply practically only to some people. Curfew was universal in principle but enforced selectively in practice. The wealthy, the powerful, the connected, they had exemptions or faced minimal enforcement. The poor faced strict enforcement and harsh penalties. Legal equality was fiction. Real enforcement was discriminatory. Third, control over time and movement is control over people's lives in fundamental ways. The curfew bell determined when you could work, socialize, travel, and live freely. It carved the day into permitted and prohibited hours. This shaped everything about urban life, from economic activity to social relationships to political organization. Controlling when people can move is nearly as powerful as controlling where they can go. Fourth, most people accepted curfew. It wasn't universally resented or constantly resisted. Many people probably believed it was necessary and proper. They accepted that the government should tell them when to go home, should have the authority to arrest them for being outside at the wrong time, should control this basic aspect of their daily lives. Acceptance of control is often more powerful than imposition of it. The curfew bell was remarkably effective social technology. With nothing more than a bell, a set of rules, and a small group of watchmen, medieval authorities controlled the movement of thousands of people every single night for hundreds of years. They created a system where most people complied voluntarily because the alternative was too costly. They established expectations and norms that made nighttime movement suspect and staying home normal. Modern surveillance and control systems are far more sophisticated. But they're often less effective at actually controlling behavior. We have cameras, databases, digital tracking, and enormous law enforcement bureaucracies. But we don't achieve the same level of comprehensive control over population movement that the medieval curfew bell did with far simpler tools. Why? Partly because we have different values and legal frameworks. We believe in freedom of movement, at least in theory. We require more justification for restricting it. But partly because the medieval system worked through social pressure, shared expectations, and community enforcement as much as through official coercion. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone heard the bell. Everyone understood the expectations. And everyone participated in enforcing them, whether as watchmen or simply as neighbors who would report suspicious nighttime activity. The curfew bell also reveals how cities themselves function as control systems. Cities aren't just collections of buildings and people. They're organizational structures that channel behavior, restrict options, and make certain actions possible while preventing others. The walls channel movement through specific gates. The streets create paths that can be monitored. The curfew creates temporal zones where different rules apply. Modern cities do the same thing through different mechanisms. Zoning restricts what activities can happen where. Traffic laws control movement. Security systems surveil public spaces. Business hours and operating licenses determine when activities can occur. All of these create a framework of control that most people don't question because it seems natural, necessary, and in the interest of order and safety. When the curfew bell rang across a medieval city, it was announcing the government's claim to control the most basic aspects of life, where you could be and when you could be there. That claim was accepted by most people most of the time. They heard the bell, covered their fires, went inside, and stayed there until morning. They didn't need soldiers on every corner or constant surveillance. They complied because compliance was normal, expected, and enforced through a combination of official punishment and social pressure. We'd like to think we're different now, that we're freer, that we don't accept such direct control over our daily movements. But maybe we've just replaced the bell with other mechanisms that we find more acceptable, or less noticeable, or harder to recognize as control. The curfew bell was obvious. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew what it meant. The control was transparent. Our systems are more subtle. But subtle doesn't mean absent. And the medieval curfew bell, that simple technology of sound and social enforcement, accomplished something our complex modern systems often struggle to achieve: near universal compliance with rules restricting freedom, accepted by the population as necessary, normal, and natural. That bell rang for over 500 years. And in those 5 centuries, generations of urban dwellers lived their entire lives within the rhythm it created, never questioning whether cities should have the power to confine them to their homes for half of every day. That's not just control. That's control so complete that it becomes invisible, so normalized that it stops feeling like control at all. And that's the real lesson of the curfew bell. The most effective control doesn't feel like control. It feels like safety, order, community, and normalcy. Just like it did every night when that bell rang across the medieval city. And everyone went inside. And the streets fell silent until dawn.